The combat of Sekiro is a dance, a macabre game of who makes more mistakes. In each fight, the participants circle around each other, waiting for their opportunity to strike, eyes locked onto the opponent. Every stab, every slash, and every attack is an opening for the enemy to strike back, and each duel will leave you sweating and shaking, exhausted from the amount of concentration the game requires. Every move, every parry, each step in this dance must be carefully considered and evaluated before committing to it, and if it is not, the enemy can and will exploit that. Except, and here's part of the genius, the game doesn't give you enough time to properly consider each option and execute it. There are dozens of decisions that need to be made in the span of a few seconds, and each of those decisions must be correct. By the end of a fight, you lack the ability to properly evaluate each reaction, and are acting on instinct and muscle memory alone to finish the battle, dancing desperately with your foe. And when you do finish the fight, that feeling of triumph, of glory, is waiting for you. You bested this boss, defeated a great foe, and it feels incredible. Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice is an amazing game, as I hope I outlined just now. The combat is perhaps the crowning achievement of it, and it innovates in some really interesting ways. But it has some unfortunate flaws and some painful missed opportunities. There will be spoilers in this video. If you are one of the people who bounced off of Sekiro, I encourage you to go back and try it again, and then come back to this video. My one piece of advice, if you're struggling with it, is to stop trying to play it like Dark Souls. Also, I know this video is quite long, so I've segmented it into parts, or episodes within the video, if you will. If you want to watch it in separate segments, those timestamps for that will be in the description. Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice's combat mechanics are incredible. The core loop of parrying and counterattacking is so satisfying to improve at and master, and Sekiro has some of the best combat mechanics in any game I've ever played, without exaggeration. Add on to that the many abilities you can gain through skill trees and upgrades, and the game gains even more depth. There are 5 separate skill trees, all with completely unique themes and mechanics, an upgrade tree for 10 prosthetic tools you can gain, and 3 different ninjutsu techniques. However, I've seen a lot of complaints about this game lacking depth and variety in gameplay options, and while it has less variety than Dark Souls, for example, it is actually pretty deep. I'll go into more detail later on how it gives you quite a bit more options and variety than you may think, but the execution of those options is flawed. The combat is very focused. It is all focused on that core loop, which I suppose I should explain. See, Sekiro has health bars, but unlike just about every other action game, the primary goal isn't really to get an enemy's health bar down to 0. Sure, you can kill enemies and bosses by lowering their health bars down to 0, but it's far from efficient. The goal, instead, is to break the enemy's posture. The bar at the top of the screen that is going up is the enemy's posture bar, and if you are able to get that all the way filled up, you are able to brutally take down an enemy in a death blow. Filling up the posture bar all the way is called breaking an enemy's posture, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You've tired them out, and they break posture for a moment, leaving them vulnerable. How do you fill an enemy's posture bar? Well, mainly by parrying an opponent's attacks. Since this is such a large part of the core combat loop, the parry had to be well done, and From Software nailed it. The flash of sparks, the impressive sound, the animations for deflecting an attack, it all makes the parry so much more satisfying and gives you positive feedback when you actually carry it out, which makes you want to use it more. It teaches players the best way to play the game. You may also block in Sekiro, and if you block an attack instead of parrying it, your posture will go up and the enemy's will not. Another genius part of the posture system is that you can lessen your own posture, therefore making yourself less vulnerable to death by holding the block button. This doesn't allow you to parry, which makes you find safe and strategic times to hold the block move to lessen your own posture. The combat being so focused around this one move, the parry, lets all of the enemies and bosses be very tightly designed and polished, but this focus and polish makes the flaws in Sekiro all the more apparent. For one, it's very easy to mash the parry button. It is also the block button. If you do this, you will sometimes get perfect parries, and if you don't get a perfect parry, it will usually still block the attack. In the last bit of the game, though, the attack patterns and timings become more erratic, with smaller time windows, so this strategy isn't super viable. I think this is okay. Perhaps the extent you can take it to is a little extreme, but it can act as a sort of easy mode for less experienced players, which is a good addition. I think the developers knew this because they added an option to have a punishment for not perfect parrying in New Game Plus for all of the hardcore fans. Regardless, there are some flaws with the combat being based so heavily around parrying. For example, Some of the bosses that are super heavily designed around the parry don't really let you counterattack. Sure, on one or two of the boss's attacks you may be able to get a couple hits in, which is rewarding, but a lot of the time it feels like you are just parrying. This can become quite exhausting, which is admittedly the point. However, in my opinion, only parrying can get to be a little too monotonous. However, it's not a huge issue because not all of the bosses are designed in this way. Besides, the bosses that are designed around only parrying are done very well. A couple of the fights in this game do this, and I think fights like the Headless Ape and Genichiro could allow for a bit more counterattacking. And then there's the unique gimmick of Sekiro. It's right there in the name. Shadows die twice. When you die, you have the option to either get back up and continue from where you died, or die for real and go back to the last checkpoint. If you get back up and then die again, you're dead for real no matter what, unless you have an ability that I'll touch on later. This means that the developers can make fights and enemies much more difficult than they could in a game like Dark Souls, which I think is a major benefit of the system. It also allows for players to be less careful and more experimental because of the safety net of an extra death. This is a positive because players don't always have to be stressed and worried about dying. However, the double death system also means that you don't always have to plan for every encounter and make sure you're prepared and careful going in, which is part of the fun of the Souls games. Regardless, the gimmick changes how the game fundamentally plays, and overall makes the game better. It's also justified in the narrative, which is always a nice bonus. There have been a lot of accusations leveled at Sekiro for not being deep in its gameplay mechanics. However, this all depends on the definition of deep. As far as I can tell, the term as it is used in games criticism does not have a widely recognized meaning, and therefore these accusations could mean any number of things. Generally, though, I think what people are referring to when they say a game's mechanics are deep is that the mechanics have these two criteria. They need to be hard to master, and there needs to be a number of viable options that the player can use at any given time. In regards to the first criteria, Sekiro's combat is definitely hard to master, but it's fair and you can learn and master it. And to me that feels like depth. And even if it wasn't depth, the combat systems are still incredible feats of game design and polish. However, I will concede that the number of viable options at a given time, at least during a boss fight, is sometimes pretty low. However, this doesn't mean that you only do one thing in combat. Different types of enemy attacks will have you jumping onto them, dodging out of the way, parrying, Mikiri countering, or using a prosthetic tool or ability. This is because enemies can stab, slash, grab, attack normally, do a specialized attack, ranged attack, or sometimes a specialized unique move. Each of these has a different input that the player must perform to not get hit by it, and most of those inputs will make the enemy's posture go up. I do believe that this is another reason why there is quite a bit of depth, even compared to FromSoft's other games, because even if the player doesn't have as many options, they have to react to many more enemy attacks with many different types of counters. This feels like depth in combat, but I do understand why others who, say, greatly enjoy RPG systems wouldn't feel that way. However, there are more options than one might think. Prosthetic tools are extremely creative and fun to use, and they'll be the other main ability that you'll be using in combat. The wolf, at the beginning of the game, gets his arm cut off, so he is given a prosthetic arm which you can attach various weapons and tools to. However, using those tools is disincentivized. See, Sekiro uses spirit emblems as a kind of ammo, some of which get used up every time a prosthetic tool is used. Therefore, I didn't really use the term outside of bosses, and I only used a couple of the 10 tools at that. You can only use, at max, 20 spirit emblems per rest, so you get about 10 prosthetic tool uses per rest at the end of the game. Because of this, I didn't want to use anything, because what if I needed it later? On top of this, there is a finite amount of spirit emblems overall, and you can run out of them and just not be able to use them at all, even after resting and replenishing your spirit emblems. It's a shame that the varied use of the tools is disincentivized, really. Most of the prosthetics are very interesting. A couple of earlier tools gained are somewhat contextual, for example, an axe that can be used to break shields, but you can also use those for other things. I won't list all of the prosthetics here, but I want to touch on one of the tools, to show you what I mean. The Mist Raven allows you to essentially teleport upon being struck. a bit forward, a bit backward, to the side, or up. You can use it to reposition instead of a parry, or to get out of an enemy combo to get a couple of hits on them. It's a very creative concept and executed really well, but I'll bet because of the ammo caps, a lot of people didn't use it that much. I know I didn't use it when I wasn't actively testing out the tools. There are really multiple different options at pretty much any moment in combat, as long as you have spirit emblems. And that's my problem, the restrictions on ammo. The ammo caps and such are meant to prevent cheese, because if you could use the prosthetics indefinitely, you could just spam them and essentially win by default. By the way, cheese means using an unintended and easy way to beat a boss. The ammo achieves what it's trying to do, but I think this is far from the most elegant solution. In my opinion, rather than have every prosthetic draw from the same pool of ammo, each prosthetic should have its own separate ammo that refreshes each time you rest at a sculptor's idol. This way, it's incentivized to constantly use and switch between them, and players would actually have to use each prosthetic. It would be best if it was only allowed about 2 uses per tool, or perhaps 1 depending on the tool, so it wouldn't be overpowered. I also think, to encourage players to actually use these abilities, the limited uses should recharge over time, or perhaps recharge when you do enough perfect parries or some such. This would stop the issue of players not using prosthetics for fear of wanting or needing them later. Also, the firecracker should be nerfed. These relatively simple changes would encourage more player experimentation and also address the variety issue a lot of people had with the combat. Because I think one of the reasons a large complaint with the game was that it had a lack in variety is that people didn't use more than 1 or 2 of these tools extensively. The prosthetic tools have a very robust upgrade and progression system. This sculptor will give you various upgrades to your tools through the menu. These can range from making your prosthetics more powerful, to changing the hitbox of them, to changing their function fundamentally. This costs materials to use as well as gold, both of which you can pick up from killing normal enemies. The prosthetic tools work well as a use for golden materials, and I absolutely love the upgrades. They feel substantial, and for the most part are very fun. However, they still suffer from the same problems regarding low usage. There is a much more robust progression and leveling system found in Shadows Die Twice, though. It's done through skill trees and abilities. You start out with 1 skill tree, the Shinobi tree. This one is the most general tree, and probably the most robust one as well. You may gain more skill trees as you progress through the game via side quests and some such, which gives you quite an incentive to do the side content. One you can obtain by just talking to a character, which I very nearly missed. You can gain a variety of different upgrades through these trees, including passive things like stealthier stealth and active combat abilities that give you damaging combos or a movement-based sword thrust or some such. Most of these upgrades feel worthwhile and substantial, although it's sometimes pretty difficult to find the difference between before and after when you get something like quiet or stealth, or healing items heal a bit more. So these are the exception. However, upgrades that give you 1 more spirit emblem or that give you a new ability give you an instant sense of getting more powerful and are fun additions to the Wolf's moveset. Some of my favorite abilities include Praying Strike's Exorcism, which just gives an incredible sense of power with only the wolf's fists through its audio and animation, and it basically one-shots enemy posture for most ordinary enemies. It's so much fun to use. Shadow Rush is the ability that caps off the first tree in the game, and look at it. It's super unique and fun, but it's kind of a shame that it uses spirit emblems. I wish it just had a certain amount of times you could use it per rest. Mortal Draw is also a great large hitbox using Sekiro's second blade. Nightjar Slash and High Monk are both fun for their aerial prowess, and with High Monk you can do this, which I find extremely fun. One thing I want to touch on before we move on is the visuals and music. The visuals are great, but the color palette in the first couple of areas is samey and boring. This gets better later, and the visual design gets weirder and more interesting as the game goes on. The audio design is similarly stellar, but the music is, quite frankly, disappointing. Compared to the incredible soundtrack of the rest of From Software's games, Sekiro's music is pretty mediocre. Don't get me wrong, some of the tracks are great, but a lot of the music feels like it lacks a good melody. It also feels kind of generic at times. Those aren't my only issues with the music, but I don't want to delve deep into it here. This was super disappointing to me, and why you'll hear me mostly using other music for most of this video. I do believe that Sekiro has the best combat system in any From Software game, and very possibly the best in any game ever. And the supposed lack of variety, even if it is there, isn't a huge deal, because the combat is so stellar. The posture system is genius, and breaking an enemy's posture with parries so you can inflict a giant death blow upon them is one of the best combat loops in any game I've ever experienced. The progression is fun, and most of the upgrades feel substantial, giving you a reason to fight and loot. The upgrades and abilities themselves dramatically improve the already amazing combat system. This integral part of Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, the combat, was executed masterfully. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice's boss combat is magnificent. From Software is known for their bosses for a reason. There are 13 major bosses in Sekiro, as well as a whole host of minor bosses or mini-bosses. These major bosses, each and every one, are elegantly and incredibly designed. They are intensely difficult. Almost every boss I died at least a dozen times. Each time I grew beyond frustration into anger, and then just fell into a state of unfeeling apathy. Then, as I got closer and closer to beating a boss, it got more stressful, and by the final stages of the boss fight, I would get really nervous, start to act on instinct alone, barely even thinking about what I'm doing, and then, shaking, I would beat the boss with a triumphant feeling of euphoria. This feeling is what really sells the Soulsborne genre more than anything else, and it's truly incredible. I often see people compare Sekiro to a rhythm game. You parry with very specific timings and wait for your opening to strike. But to me, it feels more like a fight. And yes, I know that's actually what it is, and what I've said sounds kind of silly. But Sekiro has captured the feelings, those emotions of a fight so well that the only thing I can think to compare it to is what it actually is. Because it feels like an actual real fight. Mistakes matter and you can't make too many of them. Every input counts. It really makes you feel like a samurai. Jokes aside, this game is pretty much the perfect samurai game. See, this is the first From Software game that isn't a role-playing game. You don't customize or role-play as your character, and the wolf has a predefined role and set of traits within the game's narrative. The wolf is the main character, by the way, the one you play as. See, in Dark Souls, FromSoft lets the player play in a way that the character they created would. You know, role-playing, because it's a role-playing game. There are multitudes of ways to play in Dark Souls in service of this, but since the wolf in Sekiro is a predefined character, they designed the game around that character in the way he would fight and do things, forcing the player by design to play the game in that way. This game teaches you and coerces you into playing like the main character, the wolf, Sekiro. This is a genius way to characterize the main character. This is perhaps the prime example of show don't tell, or maybe it's something else entirely, because the main character's personality and traits, his style of fighting and the way he fights, is shown directly to the player by the player's actions, not the game. The game is telling you its story through you. The game shows you the wolf's exceptional patience. You, and by extension, him, wait until the perfect chance to strike and parry everything else with minimal movement. The way that your posture goes down when you stand still and block especially reinforces this. It shows you his skill. He executes every move with a frightening precision, if you do, that is. His every move is a deft showcase of his training and experience, and the animations display that well. The stealth mechanics show you how adept he is at slipping by undetected. It shows you how calm and controlled he is. The animations make his every move look very, very deliberate, while lightning fast at the same time. And the game, through the way it forces you to play, shows you so much more about the wolf's character and the way he carries things out. Sekiro is so interesting and brilliant because instead of the character being an extension of the player, like in most games, the player is an extension of the character. You are playing how the character wants you to play, and that's the genius here. It's an excellent showcase of play conditioning, which is a term that H-Bomber Guy coined in his Bloodborne video. Play conditioning is, essentially, teaching the player to play in the way that you want them to, or the way that is the most fun. Since Bloodborne, FromSoft has refined and expanded upon this technique. Every facet of the wolf's style is the most effective and fun way to play this game, coercing you into wanting to play the game like the main character would do it. It's part of what makes the video games unique, and I'm extremely excited to see it expanded upon within the medium. This, to me, is what makes Sekiro so special, and its single crowning feature. Not the stellar combat, but this foray into making your player tell the story for you, because it's so much more effective than any exposition could ever be. On top of this, the bosses are a hell of a masterclass in boss design. There almost isn't a single one of the 13 major bosses that I don't absolutely love. Each one is extremely unique and brings new mechanics or playstyles to the game. The first boss is Genichiro Ashina. He is one of those you're supposed to lose this fight bosses, and it sets up an amazing rematch later. The first real boss that most people will fight is Gyobu the Demon. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This protector of Ashina Castle's gates has single-handedly fought off all the would-be attacks on the castle, and he and his horse won't let you through either. Not on your first try, anyway. His attacks are unlike most things you'll have fought to this point, with a heavy emphasis on positioning. He constantly rides away from you and charges back with his spear, and, as the wolf would, you're going to end up waiting for him to come to you patiently and parrying his attacks. However, when the opportunity presents itself, you'll be able to grapple onto him and get a few cheeky hits in. This boss doesn't soar to the heights that the rest of them seem to be able to, but since he's the first boss, the player isn't skilled enough to allow him to. One thing I should mention here is that the bosses feel like they last really long, but each one of them only takes 3 to 8 minutes maximum to beat in one try, and that encourages fighting them again and again, which is good. The next boss is Lady Butterfly. She's a trickster illusionist who uses her phantom kunai to damage you, as well as her honed martial arts skills. Her posture recovers extraordinarily fast, so this is where most players really have to learn and understand the combat of Sekiro. You must parry, parry, and parry again. She parries every one of your attacks, so most of your attacks will be essentially pointless. This boss is the game drilling into you that you need to parry, demonstrating some of the play conditioning I was talking about earlier. Her attacks are lightning fast, and she is brutal. Eventually, she summons illusionary minions that you also have to contend with. While the first phase of the fight is all about standing still and parrying, the second phase is all about dashing around her and waiting for an opening or an attack from her to parry. This is where most of the people playing the game either quit or the game clicked with them. That is to say, they got it. They understood what the game wanted from them and understood how to execute that. The ones who quit, well, I guess this game's combat system isn't for everyone. Although, most people who've pushed through and played further say that the game's combat system is one of the best, and definitely the best From Software combat system. So, if you're one of those quitters, I would recommend trying it again. You can push through, even if it is very hard. And it's worth mentioning that the game's combat is really hard. It's a Souls-like, after all, and that comes with difficulty. But it's not unfair. Far from it. There is almost no bullshit in this game, much less than the Souls games had. My advice to anyone who quit the game is this: stop trying to play Sekiro like Dark Souls, because in all probability, you're playing it wrong. Try to pay attention to and learn from what the game is telling you through its gameplay, because this game is worth a second chance. Genichiro Ashina comes next, and this is your first real fight with him. A proper rematch. The wolf has gotten stronger, and he has enough power to best his once impossible foe. Although Ashina won't go down without a fight. In fact, this is one of the hardest fights in the game the first time around. He makes you truly master the parry, while also recognizing and executing upon the tells for Makiri countering, jumping, and dodging. In his last phase, he starts to throw lightning at you, and this mechanic is really neat. If he throws lightning at you, you have to jump up in the air, parry, and then attack, all while in the air, to fling his lightning back at him. It's a very satisfying move to pull off, especially because if you hit the ground before flinging it back, you take lots of damage. This fight is one of the high points of the game, and honestly one of the best moments. Guardian Ape is a very different fight. A wild, giant ape with unpredictable and erratic movements. It is protecting a flower from the grasp of our Shinobi. This battle is much more in the vein of the Souls boss fights than the Sekiro ones. It throws everything you know out the window. You can't stand still, and you have to constantly move to avoid his relentless attacks. It's brutally difficult because you have to essentially learn how to play the game a whole different way. And then, after many attempts, you kill him by cutting off his head with his own sword that's strapped to his back. And then, this happens. You have to switch back to the regular style of fighting to defend yourself. This is an incredible twist. Before we move on, though, I'd like to go on a bit of a tangent. I said earlier that you have to learn how to play Sekiro in a whole different way for this fight on the spot, and that's somewhat accurate, and the point of the statement still holds true. However, that you have to do this on the spot isn't strictly true. For moments like this, where you have to learn new things spontaneously, the game subtly trains you. See, in the entire area in which Guardian Ape lives, there are monkeys that you may fight, and they train you to fight against the Guardian. Just by fighting them, they subtly teach you that you have to avoid their attacks, run around them, dodge out of the way. And there are even a couple of monkeys that have swords, and essentially train you to fight against his second phase. The game does this in a couple of other places, which I'll talk about later. The developers know that these bosses are going to feel unfair if the player just has no idea how to fight them going in. In fact, it probably would be unfair. The player can't run away from the boss, and the boss's attack patterns are difficult to learn on top of learning a whole new style of play. If the developers train the player to play in that style right before the fight, 1, the player has a better chance and it feels more fair, even if it is only subconsciously, and 2, the developers can make the fight harder because the player isn't completely relearning the game. Folding screen monkeys aren't a traditional boss. They're more of a puzzle and a movement challenge than an actual fight. However, the game counts it as a mainline boss, so I'll discuss it here. There are 4 different monkeys, and they each have a gimmick of sorts. One is invisible and follows you around, so you have to catch him by surprise behind you. The next one will alert all of the other monkeys when it sees you, causing all of them to run away, and they're pretty hard to catch. The third one has really good eyesight, and the last good hearing. It's an interesting concept to try and catch them all, but it never really worked for me as a puzzle, the 3 times I went through this game, because it's way easier to just try and brute force it, or stealth some of the enemies. It didn't feel like a proper puzzle or test of skill. I think the concepts are interesting, and it was meant to be a test of stealth skill, but as we'll talk about, the stealth in this game is pretty surface level. I definitely see what they were going for here. The execution just isn't the best. Still an interesting experience overall, though. Corrupted Monk defends the entrance to another realm, a spectral reflection of what is to come. A boss that recharges posture alarmingly fast, this giant leaps and floats at stunning speeds, calmly swinging her spear at Sekiro. To fight this one, all you need to do, really, is parry. This definitely isn't the best boss in the game. She's too easy and simplistic for this late in the game, in my opinion. Great Shinobi Owl is next. The wolf, or Sekiro's adopted father. His goal is to try to take over Ashina with his interior ministry, which is the name for a group of elite shinobi, or ninjas. This boss is incredible, because since he trained you, he pretty much has the exact same moveset as you. He has the same combat arts, the same shinobi firecrackers, the same sword slashes and such. The one thing he has that you don't is a grenade that, if you are hit by it, will stop you from healing for the next 30 seconds or so. This is another really interesting gimmick about this boss, because you can never get too close or overcommit to something. I mean, in normal combat you can't overcommit either, but especially so with this, because then you literally can't make more than 2 mistakes for around the next 30 seconds, which is quite a long time in boss combat. Owl is a really good boss and a super fun mirror fight. However, by this point in the game, he may be a little too easy, in my opinion. I beat him in 5 or 6 tries. This may be due to the fact that the shinobi enemies and mini-boss before him trained me subconsciously in some of the ways he would fight, but that was intentional on the part of From Software. I feel like he should have been a Genichiro level difficulty boss, but maybe I just had an easier time with him than most. Instead of fighting the Great Shinobi Owl, you can decide to side with him instead, to get a different ending of the game. If you do this, you must fight Emma the Physician and Isshin. The Emma fight precedes the Isshin fight every time you do it, but she is not that difficult once you learn her. It gets pretty natural to kill her without taking 1 hit after a while. But then you have to fight Isshin. Isshin is the final boss of this game in both the good ending and the bad ending. This is the bad ending, and this rendition of him is easier, but noticeably different from his true form. For one, he is much older here, and he uses fire instead of lightning to attack you in his final phase. He is somewhat easier than the good ending Isshin, but in my opinion his attacks are a bit harder to learn, because you haven't really dealt with fire before at this point. These 2 bosses are great for what they are for where they are in the game, and very good challenges. Let's get back to the good path through the game. True Corrupted Monk is a silly boss. Why is this a mainline boss? Or, more specifically, why is the first Corrupted Monk a mainline boss? True Corrupted Monk is just a repeat of that fight with a couple of extra moves and another health bar. This is more of the repeat boss problem that I'll go in depth about later, just with an actual mainline boss. The first Corrupted Monk should have been replaced with a different boss entirely, in my opinion. This repetition made it so I could beat True Corrupted Monk on the first try. Not hard enough in the slightest, because I had done it before. The wolf travels to the Divine Realm to confront the injured god, Divine Dragon, next. This boss is very, very strange. It's one of those bosses that you're supposed to beat on your first try. It's not supposed to be difficult. A cinematic moment, if you will. And I think that it kind of lands. I was confused when playing it at first. I was thinking, this is supposed to be killing God, right? This feels too easy for killing God? But I think in the end, this really worked as a powerful moment. First, because you're not killing God, per se. From my point of view, it seems like you are proving it yourself to them, and then they offer you their eye so you can take their tears. It's not super easy, which makes it slightly better in that regard. It's very focused around the lightning mechanic, so if you haven't mastered it by that point, you're actually kind of in danger. But the mechanic's really easy to master, and the game does more of the training with enemies that hurl lightning at you right outside of the entrance to the Divine Realm. But that's not the point. The point is that it's a pretty amazing set piece with a poignant ending, and it works perfectly well as that. The penultimate boss is the Demon of Hatred. He's an optional endgame boss that you can complete once the final boss of this game unlocks. This guy is more in the vein of a Bloodborne or Dark Souls boss than any of the other fights, and doesn't truly feel like a Sekiro fight. It's a fun fight, but it's more of a test of endurance than anything. It's long, and more focused on positioning and dodging out of the way of the demon's attacks. By no means is he the best boss in the game, but it's a nice change of pace from the constant parrying. He's still a hard fight, though, and you can't make too many mistakes. The area he's housed in is this big arena, which I think is great because most of the fights in this game are in small enclosed spaces. It's just a nice change of pace, and I think a good and somewhat worthwhile fight. Ishin Ashina, the Sword Saint, the final boss. The reborn grandfather of Ashina, the master of sword and spear. This boss is simply incredible. 3 health bars, 3 phases will test all of the skills you've gained throughout the game. Your last fight with Genichiro precedes the fight with Ishin every time you fight him, which is a nice test and marker of your skills. Of course, by this point he's easy, which is good because the real boss, Ishin, comes after him. Ishin will beat you handily, again and again, for hours. Slowly you'll learn Ishin's patterns and attacks. Every one of these attacks will have short but distinctive telegraphs, and are really well made for the skill level you'll be at in this part of the game. Eventually you'll start to get him to his last health bar consistently, and then you'll start to hope again that you can actually do this. And many tries later, you'll get it. You'll finally defeat him, and it's one of the best feelings I've ever had in a game. Another stroke of genius is that every single one of the Ashina bosses, mini-bosses, and enemies have been training you for this very moment. The Ashina Elite has precisely one attack, which you must master to defeat him, and Ishin has the same attack. Ishin has a gun, like some of the Ashina enemies. He has similar attacks to Genichiro, and he has the same spear attacks as the 7 Spears mini-bosses. There are other examples, but I won't go into them now. It's a really incredible way to ensure that players have a chance in approaching this fight. The animations in this fight are similarly incredible, and the cutscene before it is hauntingly ominous. Overall, the bosses in Sekiro are some of the best I've ever fought, and present an incredible challenge. They have fun and engaging mechanics, readable attacks, compelling twists, and unique theming and atmosphere. Though the repetition and design of a small amount of them irked me, I think that the vast majority of the bosses here are extremely well designed, and the way that the game makes you play through the design of the game's mechanics and bosses is innovative and astounding. I hope to see more of this type of design in the future. Mini-bosses are foes that are harder than ordinary enemies and appear like bosses, but they generally have fewer attacks, smaller movesets, and are easier than the main 13. Most of them are pretty well designed, but some of them have glaring issues, and some of them are pretty repetitive. There are strange difficulty spikes and valleys within these mini-bosses, and some of them seem to be designed much harder or easier than the rest, which would be fine, except for the fact that some of the harder ones are placed before the easier ones, which is strange, because this makes the difficulty curve very weird. There were multiple occasions in late game areas where I would beat a mini-boss on my first try, but in early game areas I would be dying just as much as I would for a main boss on a mini-boss. Perhaps this is just a result of my personal weaknesses and strengths as a player, but I don't really think so. There are a couple of reasons for this. First and foremost, there are repeat bosses, which are repetitive, obviously. I won't say it's lazy, but I just think it's unnecessary. I understand that mini-bosses are a large portion of the game, but that doesn't mean that there needs to be an arbitrary number of mini-bosses. The Drunkard is repeated, Ogre is repeated, the Swordsman is repeated multiple times, amongst others. These repeats are exceedingly easy because you've already learned to master the boss's attacks and such. I will admit that each mini-boss that is repeated is optional, but that doesn't make it any better. However, what does make it better is the fact that each of these bosses tries to have a twist on it, the mini-boss, to recontextualize it. Let me give you an example. The Ogre fight, at first, is in a somewhat open space, with an easy way to get out of reach of the Ogre. In the second fight, though, you are contained in a very small room. The Ogre is an erratic, lunging boss who dives around and tries to grab the wolf frantically. This style of fighting makes it so you have to kite around the boss to not get grabbed in one shot, running circles around him. But in the second fight, you're in a closed-in room where you can't really fight him like you did before, so you have to think of and learn a different way to fight this Ogre. Or at least it should make you think like that. But it fails because you've fought this Ogre before, and you can basically use the same strategies because the room it's set in literally lets you lead the Ogre into a certain movement pattern around a pillar in the center. Therefore, it doesn't recontextualize the fight enough, and is easy to do in one try, because there's only very small or meaningless changes from the original fight. It feels very repetitive and boring because of this. It seems like From Software tried to make these fights interesting and recontextualized, but largely failed. Uninteresting repeat fights like this should not be in the game, and they bring the game down. There is one repeat boss that they did a good job recontextualizing, though. The Guardian Ape is a main boss, and once you fight him, he reappears in a cave in the Ashinda Depths as a mini-boss. The twist here is that once you get to a certain point in that battle, his mate appears. She has his first phase moveset, while he has the moveset of the second phase in the boss fight. This wouldn't normally be fair, because you're essentially fighting two bosses at once. But since you fought and mastered both of these phases before, it's an interesting and fun twist to have to deal with both of these apes at once, and it completely recontextualizes the fight in a very good way. This is enough to make the fight worth it and compelling, whereas just adding enemies is not. See, in a lot of the repeat fights, the twist is just more enemies. There are just more regular basic enemies that you have to deal with while fighting the boss you've already fought before. For example, the second sword mini-boss in the Ashina Outskirts just has enemies around him, whereas the first one didn't. This isn't compelling, this is just padding, adding more time of stealthing around before confronting the mini-boss. In fact, adding enemies actively makes the boss less fun, because Sekiro's combat system isn't really designed for fighting multiple enemies at once. Fighting multiple at once can be an entertaining challenge, but the game encourages you to just pick them off one by one through tedious stealth. The extra enemies and the repeat mini-boss are meaningless and should not be there. Many bosses do this exact same thing, trying to put a twist on a fight that doesn't affect it much. Those repeat bosses are very problematic, but only because they're repetitive. It doesn't mean that the mini-bosses are bad. Far from it. Most of the mini-bosses are very well designed. They're not like the main bosses and don't have as many attacks, but they shouldn't be like those bosses. They're meant to be less challenging obstacles on your way to the big bosses. Mostly they have 3, 4, or 5 attacks, whereas the normal enemies will just have 1 or 2. On top of this, mini-bosses' attacks are harder to parry or dodge, and take more watching and learning to be able to effectively defend against them. With mini-bosses, it's also harder to find openings to attack, and they're fewer and farther between. Basically, they're more challenging than normal enemies, and easier than bosses. The mini-bosses force you to play in a multitude of playstyles. The human ones are generally parry-focused, the most common type of gameplay in Sekiro. Then there are beast-like enemies that force you to run around them, kite them, dodge their attacks, and focus on positioning. And finally, there are other sorts of mini-bosses who do either a combination of the two or something else entirely. And this is great. It provides a lot of gameplay variety within the combat, and gets you to think and play differently. I want to highlight some of the best mini-bosses in Sekiro, some of the worst ones, and some more of the mechanics involved with them. Juzo the Drunkard is actually a great mini-boss, but I think he's kind of ruined by the amount of enemies surrounding him. This led me to just cheese him by leading him away from the cluster of his minions and into this river, where you can actually fight him one-on-one, or 2-on-1 if you want to cheese even more. The designers most definitely knew this was going to happen, so they probably designed for the cheese to be an easy mode of sorts, an optional difficulty modifier within the game. However, given the choice, players will always take the optimal route instead of the fun route. This means that the vast majority of players will probably do this cheese and not have as much fun as they would if they fought the boss the way he was intended to be fought. This wouldn't be a large issue if it was just this boss, but unfortunately it permeates the rest of the game. First of all, most mini-bosses have 2 health bars, just as the wolf does. You'll have to deathblow them twice to really kill them. This is partly because you can use stealth on them. I'll go into stealth in quite a bit of detail later in the video, but all you need to know for now is that you can take 1 health bar off a mini-boss or an enemy simply by sneaking up on them. This feels to me like cheese, as it makes all of the mini-bosses that you can stealth easier than they should be, and probably less fun. There are other mini-bosses that can be easily cheesed like Juzo can be, but I don't feel the need to cover them here because it wouldn't strengthen my point. There are many mini-bosses that act as tutorials for a single mechanic or some such, especially early in the game. For example, the Shinobi Hunter is literally just a tutorial for the Mikiri counter move. They have 1 attack and it's this. This isn't a good mini-boss by any means, but I think it works fine as a tutorial. It is in fact used as an ordinary enemy later in the game, so I don't know why they have to be classified as a mini-boss when used as a tutorial. Why can't they just be a normal enemy here? There are quite a few more of these tutorial mini-bosses, and most of them are better than this, but again, it's not necessary to help my case to go over them. The Snake Eyes mini-bosses aren't the greatest of fights, even if I will praise the arena that one of them takes place in later. They just aren't very fun to fight. The Blazing Bull isn't very fun to fight either, but it's better in my opinion. These may be because it takes you out of the intended and most developed playstyle in the game, or it may be just because they aren't very well designed. Each of their attacks can be essentially countered with 1 action, that's to jump backwards and then attack. This makes the mini-boss pretty boring, because every attack you're just jumping backwards and then going back up for a hit. But you could make the argument that other bosses that I've praised have the same problem, except with the response to attacks being parrying. I don't see it that way though, because parrying requires precise timing and learning of the attacks, and every attack is different. With this, it's the exact same reaction at the same point in the attack every time. It makes it feel boring. The Great Colored Carp is a compelling mini-boss because you fight it while underwater, which adds another axis to the entire fight. This is a very cool twist on a standard mini-boss fight, and it's really unique. A lot of the mini-bosses make you fight in different ways than you normally would, and that's great for variety in gameplay. Orin of the Water is also one of my favorites because of her floating fighting style and how she trains you for the next boss, Corrupted Monk. Armored Warrior is one of the most memorable mini-bosses in the game. He acts differently from any other sword-wielding enemy. His attacks are slow and deliberate, but you can tell that he's on the edge of desperation and really wants you dead. This is some great storytelling through gameplay, which is something Sekiro actually does really well with the mini-bosses. A lot of the mini-bosses who are in the same story faction or clan or some such can be seen using similar attacks and similar weapons, which is honestly a much better way to make the player associate different bosses with each other in their mind than words spoken in-game. A lot of the bosses do this as well, and it's simply wonderful. The animations and the way bosses attack can tell you a lot about their background or emotions, too, which is exceedingly neat. Mini-bosses in Sekiro are definitely a positive addition to the game, but their addition is brought down by some flaws. One of these is unnecessary repeat fights, another is cheese being a very easily accessible and optimal strategy, and some of the bosses are just plain poor design. These flaws are by no means game-breaking, and I think the positives of the mini-bosses far outweigh the negatives. Most of them are well designed, and some get you to change your playstyle up, which is great. The last facet of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice's combat is the normal combat. This is just encounters with normal enemies placed in the world. The combat system still holds up great here. Every enemy has 1 or 2 combos or attacks, and they aren't very complicated. There are a couple of general archetypes for these enemies, at least at first. Later into the game it gets more complex. The enemies are generally segmented by area, as per usual in most games. This means that different enemy types will only show up in some areas. As the game gets weirder and more outlandish, so do the enemy designs, at least visually. See, at the start of the game, in the first area, the Ashina outskirts, the enemies are very basic. Generic samurai-looking enemies, one with a sword, one with a gun. They don't have very many attacks, and are essentially tutorial enemies. Of course, they can still kill the inexperienced player because it's a From Software game, but as far as the enemies go in this game, they're easy. The Ashina are the starting enemies, almost used as an introductory tutorial for the rest of the game. There's two very similar katana enemy types, one slightly stronger. Another has a rifle, another is a sentry, which will bang a pan when they see you to alert other enemies of your presence. There's also one with a spear, which you must Mikiri counter, which is this on screen. I won't go through all of the rest of the enemies, but I need to go through a couple more before I get to the point. The Taro are a group of giant ogre-like beings. They're fat and extraordinarily strong. But this is all of the enemies in the first area. Aside from the Taro, they all look pretty similar. A guy with a gun and a guy with a sword, plus a rare big one. Generally, there are about 5 or 6 unique enemies per area, and some of them are very similar to each other. In fact, the bandits of the Hirata State and the Ashina army only have very, very minor differences in enemy variety. One being that sometimes the swordsmen in the Hirata Estate have torches, and that instead of a spear enemy in the Hirata State, there's an axe enemy. And then a lot of these enemies are reused again and again throughout the game. In fact, in the final area of the game, there's a sword enemy, an enemy with a bow, and one with a spear. The same 3 archetypes used in the first area. There's another that amounts to a reskin of the bow enemy, to a soldier that throws balls at you, and the spear enemy has a variation with a lightning attack. Each of these has slightly different attack patterns than you're used to with the more common types of these enemies. And then there is one wholly new enemy in the final area. It's an interesting enemy that actually forces you to use stealth. Very well made. Where the problem comes in, though, is that this is the final new area of the game. How is there only one wholly new enemy here? How is it deemed acceptable that fighting these enemies would be extremely similar to fighting the normal variations of these enemies, just with one more enemy type? I should have to learn many new enemies in the last area of the game. It should be a final test of player skill in fighting and learning new normal enemies. Instead, they place an extreme multitude of these old enemy types everywhere, and the new, interesting enemy type is not even used in the second half of the area. Here, let me show you how this area is set up. The first half of the place is designated to be pretty enclosed. It introduces you to a new enemy, the Palace Noble, and they can't really be confronted head-on. If you run at them, they'll enfeeble you, aging the wolf in a matter of seconds. So you must use stealth to get past them. However, you also have to contend with the archers and swordsmen that will be interrupting you. So the first half of this area is an interesting give and take between stealthing, fighting, running, and hiding. It's really enjoyable and acts as a test of what little skill you may have gained in stealth, as well as outright fighting enemies while trying to avoid others. The second half of the last region is, frankly, boring. It's just the same 2 enemies you've been seeing all game, except spiced up a little bit to make them harder. And they're laid out and placed in such a manner that stealth is highly encouraged. So you're not even really engaging in combat, you're stealthily picking off the enemies one by one. Which, don't get me wrong, is very fun in its own right, but that skill was already tested in the previous half of the area. Shouldn't this bit be a final combat test against regular enemies? In Sekiro, there's a real lack of enemy variety. A lot of the enemies are just the archetype of guys with swords, with slightly different movesets from one another. Of course, there's other enemy types. Some of them, though, I do not believe to be good enemies. For example, most of the enemies in the Ashina depths aren't that interesting to me. I get that they're supposed to be this undead horde, because there's so many of them. And at first glance, there's quite a bit of variety, but since they're so slow, they're not a threat in the slightest, and their attacks are easily avoidable. Even though there are 9 different types of them, they don't make for interesting enemies and feel very samey. In contrast to this, the enemies of the gun fort feel varied and interesting, even though there's only 3 enemy types. These enemies are pretty different to anything else you'll have seen in the game. There's enemies with cannons that fire huge but slow explosions at you, crack shots with rifles faster than anything the wolf has fought before, and enemies with huge, unparryable shotguns. These 3 enemies are enough to make a whole area feel unique and new, because they're also different from anything else in the game, and you fundamentally engage with each of them in different ways, making for varied playstyles in a short span of time. This is why it's so disappointing that so many of the enemies are just what amounts to swordsmen. You engage with them in very similar ways every time you fight a swordsman. The Senpou Temple monks are not swordsmen, however they are very similar to that archetype. The only difference is that they fight with their legs and their arms, and they can ingest certain buffs. No unique attacks or anything, really, so I would say they still count as swordsmen. Some have spears. One type is pretty unique, but you see what I mean? I just don't understand why the cast of enemies lacks so much variety. It makes a lot of the combat feel samey and makes it get boring, in fact. I have a bunch of ideas for more enemies to make things feel more interesting when fighting, and the ideas are pretty simple. One idea is that there could be enemies that leap at the wolf and try to grab him, similar to one of the Guardian Ape's attacks. Or perhaps an enemy with a grab, like this mini-boss has. Maybe a flying enemy that requires the shuriken prosthetic tool. Maybe one that uses the grappling hook like some of the bosses do, so the wolf could take away their weapons, perhaps. An enemy that lunges at you. These are just a handful of ideas. Each one would be engaged with in a different way than the swordsmen, which generally come down to attack or parry. You'd have to dodge attacks, use your prosthetics, use your grappling hook, and more. In fact, enemies that forced you to use certain prosthetic tools could be a good way to get players to use more prosthetics. Not enough enemies change up your playstyle enough, or at least normal enemies. The flaw of somewhat little enemy variety is lessened slightly by the sheer amount of mini-bosses that do, a lot of the time, change your playstyle, but combat against regular enemies gets boring and samey after a little bit of time, and isn't as fleshed out as it could be. However, I think one thing that this game does very well in regards to enemies is the varied environments that you fight them in. Sekiro handles verticality extremely well, and some of the most memorable enemy encounters in the game deal with verticality. I'll talk more about the movement and traversal later, but just let it be said that the wolf's moveset is uniquely suited to combat in which he's fighting an uphill or downhill battle. And especially since a lot of these encounters are in narrow switchbacks or paths, there's no room to kite or dodge the enemies, so your playstyle will invariably change. I mean, take this encounter in Senpou Temple. It's an uphill battle for the wolf, with a sheer cliffside with narrow wooden paths climbing up it. There are multiple points for you to grapple onto, and the attack ability that you can do right after the grapple meshes really well with this. Then, to subvert your expectations, there are ranged enemies placed so they can interrupt your grapples, to force you to be careful about it. The enemies on the wooden ramps are designed in a way where it's very difficult to fight them head-on without moving and kiting, and the ramp forces you to face them head-on. So that, as well as the fact that you're fighting uphill, recontextualizes how you engage with these enemies. A lot of the encounter areas have very good design, but I'll go into level design later. One more example, because I really want to convince you of the quality of this game. I've been somewhat negative about the combat against ordinary enemies so far, but it has many redeeming qualities. As a showcase of this, there's an area in the Sunken Valley containing the gun-wielding soldiers. It introduces you to each of the types of soldiers in a controlled environment, and then does this. Fighting your way up is a test of patience and reaction time, because you must wait for openings between shots to grapple up the cliff, and also parry the bullets in midair that do come at you. It's a really well put together encounter. Also, parrying bullets just feels really good. Pulling off a parry feels awesome in general, but bullets are on a whole other level. I suppose it's high time we talk about the stealth. It does account for quite a bit of the combat you will be doing in Sekiro. After all, you can't take out the entirety of Ashina's army with force alone. Some finesse is required, by which I mean perfectly mediocre stealth mechanics. They're fine, I suppose. To be fair, I don't play stealth games often, so I'm not sure I have a good reference point for quality stealth. However, I think it's still fair to say that stealth in Sekiro isn't great. The stealth mechanics are very basic and generic. You can crouch to move around at a slower rate, but reduce your noise and profile. Tall grass keeps you hidden from enemies unless they're close enough, and you can backstab enemies to instantly kill them. You can gain upgrades and abilities to make yourself quieter so enemies won't hear you while you're closer to them, although these are kind of nebulous and confusing as to what they actually do, and don't have any real noticeable effect in my experience. You can also do a mid-air death blow where you drop down on an enemy to instantly kill them. Enemies seem to generally have a cone of sight, and it's just best to stay behind them and away from them. But one interesting thing about the system is that you can move around quickly to the grapple and reposition relatively easily. That's really all, I think. Not very interesting stealth mechanics or deep stealth mechanics, but functional. As I said, mediocre. The areas in world aren't usually explicitly designed around stealth. Usually the areas try to be balanced between straight combat and stealth, and because of this, both sides of the gameplay suffer. In areas where it's explicitly designed for one or the other, where there's only stealth, only combat, the game is generally much better. For example, this area in Ashina Castle seems to be designed specifically for stealth. The enemies are patrolling around, generally have their backs to you, and there's this little bit in the ceiling that you can hide in. It's one of the best stealth sections in the game. There are multiples of examples of encounters designed around purely combat, but I talked about some of them earlier when talking about enemy variety. What I'd rather do here is talk about an encounter that tries to balance stealth and combat and doesn't do it very well. I think the encounter in the Ashina outskirts containing this mini-boss fails at the stealth combat balance. It has some great potential, though. See, there's this sentry enemy who will alert the rest of the enemies if she spots you, so obviously stealthing to kill her is the optimal solution. But then, after that, the player's best course of action is to mitigate damage to the wolf, so try to stealth all of the enemies, because they have to face a mini-boss afterwards. The thing is, this encounter is much more fun once you stealth these enemies, and then fight the rest while also running away from the boss. On top of that, the stealth mechanics, if you want to take the least damage possible, necessitate going through the tall grass to hide from enemies, for them to forget about you, and then go back and stealth kill a couple of them, and repeat the process. The issue here is that waiting part. Waiting is never fun as a game mechanic, but since there's no incentive to fight instead of stealth, players will do it, and therefore have less fun. The reason it's so difficult to maintain that balance is that given the opportunity, the player will almost always choose stealth. Fighting against multiple enemies doesn't come naturally to most, and therefore players will try to pick off certain enemies with stealth. And when the encounter design and world design is balanced well, it feels awesome to do so, to strategically kill some enemies with stealth and then go in for the actual combat after that. When that balance is struck, the game's general combat is at its best, and the enemy design seems to agree with me. For example, the Grimm Troupe are generally ones that are designed to be hard to stealth, but it's better to do so. And as I discussed earlier, these design choices should make you play like the wolf, and this should be excellent play conditioning. Sekiro is willing to do anything to get to Kuro, the boy he is charged with protecting. Except, there's nothing stopping players from just stealth killing all of the enemies in a certain encounter instead of only some of them. This, first and foremost, is worse than the balance, because the moment-to-moment stealth gameplay is much less fun than the combat. On top of this, stealthing every encounter makes it that much more repetitive to fight, because you're engaging in the same very shallow stealth every time. And on top of that, you're not playing like Sekiro would fight if you do this, in my opinion, so that may throw off the excellent play conditioning. It's not a good solution to just say, don't stealth, either, even if stealthing is less fun. Players, when given the option, will always go the easiest and most optimal route. So, in my opinion, there should be an incentive to fight head-on. I think one of the concepts from the recent Ghosts of Tsushima, if reworked, could work wonders here. See, in Ghosts of Tsushima, the main narrative conflict is that the main character must use stealth and similar assassination techniques as seen here to survive, except his teachings and moral code tell him to be honorable and fight everyone he assassinates fairly. I don't think this narrative theme should be adopted, but I do think that if this were made into a gameplay system, it would solve some issues within Sekiro. Perhaps, if you fight head-on, you get a little bit more experience and money than you normally would. For one, it would provide an incentive to fight and stealth, so you could take out some enemies with stealthing and then deal with the rest by fighting. It would create a risk-reward system. This may de-incentivize using stealth too much, however, so it shouldn't be too much of an increase in rewards. However, some of the encounters, I feel, could be designed much better to evoke the aforementioned balanced, even with this change. The play conditioning in this facet of the game could definitely serve to be better. While I'm very conflicted about it, stealth's inclusion is ultimately a benefit, I think, because it plays into the fantasy the game is trying to give you as well as the wolf's fighting style, and it can be very fun. However, it's not a huge benefit to the game, and definitely doesn't deserve as big as a spotlight as it gets. Running past and through groups of enemies is also a viable way to get past them. You don't always have to engage with them. Also, since the wolf is so fast and has so many movement options, and since he dies twice, you can be less careful. This is neither a positive nor a negative in my eyes. In one way, it makes it so it's easier to get past places you've already been, but makes it so you can just kind of skip some of encounters and areas, which makes it so you don't have to improve as much of the game. That can be detrimental to the difficulty curve. In conclusion, moment-to-moment gameplay in Sekiro is very fun. Most enemies are pretty well designed, although very lacking in variety. The level design and encounter design can be great, although I'll delve more into that soon. Stealth could be much improved, and the verticality is great. There are too many sword soldiers, but the basic combat mechanics are fun and well designed enough that the combat against ordinary enemies is great, albeit quite a bit flawed. In the introductory cinematic to the story, we get a little bit of the wolf's backstory. He, as a child, was orphaned in the war between Ashina and another clan, and he was adopted by a shinobi, a great shinobi owl. Later, he will grow to become one of the most powerful shinobi, but we don't know that yet. The next thing we see is this. Our hero, the wolf, wakes up in a sewer of sorts. A mysterious woman gives him a letter. He reads it, and it gives him hope for something that was lost. He rises from his position on the floor and jumps up, making his way through an elegantly designed encounter that serves as a brutal introduction to stealth. He passes dozens of guards and reaches his charge. Lord Kuro has the dragon's blood. He's the latest in a long bloodline of those blessed with the immortality-inducing blood, and that blood is the central conflict of Sekiro's story. There are multiple factions warring and coveting Kuro's blood, and the effects it has. To me, this is a really interesting conflict because I like the idea of multiple factions warring over a human, and then having to convince that human to work with them. That is an interesting concept to me, but the immortality is not. It's a boring MacGuffin, but I think it serves its purpose. See, if Kuro gives his blood to someone else, they gain immortality, and this is how the wolf can die as many times as he likes. It makes for an interesting game mechanic, and this is a good justification for that. Also, Kuro is a kid, which makes it more interesting because he can't really use his own power that effectively, and is very idealist. The wolf escorts Kuro to a secret exit of the Ashina castle, but their way is barred by Genichiro Ashina, the grandson of Isshin Ashina, who brought the Ashina clan to power. Genichiro is a powerful foe, and handily beats our shinobi in a boss fight that you're supposed to lose. The wolf's arm is cut off in this fight, and Genichiro captures Kuro. This tutorial area serves its purpose as an introduction to stealth, exploration, and combat, and serves it well. The wolf, battered, bruised, and bloodied, slowly wakes up from his slumber in a rundown shack in the outskirts of Ashina. There is a strange sculptor hunched over a wooden figurine, working away at it with his singular arm. He gifts the wolf a prosthetic arm, one that he himself had used previously. The wolf may attach different prosthetic tools to his arm, as you already know. The sculptor's home and the surrounding patch of land acts as a hub for the first half of the game, and as you progress, a shop unlocks here and other such things. This is where you can gain most of the upgrades to your prosthetic tools and healing items. It functions well enough as a hub, but I'll come back to it later when talking about the overall world design. Sculptor's idols are this game's checkpoints. If you die twice, you'll respawn here and lose half of your experience in gold. There's a percentage chance that you won't lose them, and the percentage is lowered every time you died. There's a way to reset it, and it's linked to a plague within the world. Basically, the more the wolf dies, he runs out of life force to take from the world or something to respawn, and starts taking it from other people, giving them the dragon rot plague. There's a way to cure everyone and raise that percentage chance that you don't lose experience when you die. We exit the sculptor's isolated home after he gives the wolf his first prosthetic tool, and the only one that's perpetually attached, the grappling hook. This lets the wolf reach high places and move around the world much faster than he would otherwise, by latching onto a predefined points and flinging himself towards them. This allows for much more verticality in the world design, and I've already discussed how much of a good thing that is, and it also allows for more fun and fluid traversal. Those of you who watched my last video may recall that I was very critical of the grapple in Ori and the Will-o'-the-Wisps. And the grapple in that game is very similar in function to this one. It can only be used at certain points and can only attach to certain points. There are two major differences here that make me like Sekiro's version of this idea better than Ori's. The first and most obvious reason is that Sekiro is a 3D game whereas Ori is 2D. This means that Sekiro's version has many more opportunities for interesting ways to traverse with it, because there are more options for moving in different directions. The second, and more important in my opinion, is that there are exponentially more chances to use it. Basically, any roof can be latched onto, and at any point there is usually a chance to use it very close to the player. Both of these mean that the inherently uninteresting action of hitting a button to basically immediately latch onto and move to a place is much more compelling. It can also make it so that the wolf can reach interesting places he wouldn't be able to otherwise, and the world can be designed better. This doesn't mean that the grappling hook comes without issues, however, but I'll discuss those later when I discuss the broader issues with the world design. We follow our hero as he grapples his way into the outskirts of the Ashina clan's claimed land. The soldiers of Ashina attack him on sight, and I didn't really understand why at first, and it's never explained, but I think it can be safely inferred that he is either wanted by the clan leaders, or that the Ashina army has orders to repel any and all intruders and newcomers to the land. This area is actually pretty well designed, specifically this part. Most of the encounters here are either combat-centric or a good balance, with only a couple of exceptions. You will encounter many sculptor's idols along the way, almost too many. It feels as if there's one after every fight. It's fine this early in the game because players won't be very good at combat just yet, so one fight may be pretty stressful. The purpose of benches in Hollow Knight wasn't just to give you a checkpoint to respawn at. This relates back to Sekiro, I promise. I'm not just talking about Hollow Knight for the sake of talking about Hollow Knight, but play Hollow Knight. I'm just highlighting a facet of it that I think should be used to a greater extent in Sekiro. In Hollow Knight, the benches are few and far between, and death is scary because you have to go all the way back to the last bench you were at, and then make it back to where you were to recover all your money. In Sekiro, the sculptor's idols act similarly to benches as resting points, but there are so many of them close to each other in the starting area, and some other areas, that the potential of death isn't as suspenseful as it could be. I think half of this game's sculptor's idols could be removed, and it would still work, probably work better. There are simply too many of these after almost every encounter, so you don't have to go through it more than once. It may be argued that this is a good thing, that it doesn't get repetitive to go through the same encounter more than once, but I think fewer sculptor's idols would add to the suspense, and that would be a very good thing, because dying isn't really a huge deal, and I never felt the same suspense that I would at low health in Hollow Knight or Dark Souls. I felt some suspense to be sure, but there was always a checkpoint close enough that it wasn't a huge deal. As I said, I feel if over half of the sculptor's idols were removed, the game would be much improved. For example, this area. Look how close this one is to the other sculptor's idol. It just seems kind of silly and could be improved greatly. The sculptor has given the wolf a way to look into his past. See, he has some sort of amnesia and can't remember the night everything went wrong. So, the sculptor has him rest at a Buddha statue to look into his past. The flashback is actually a playable area called the Hirata Estate. It's a well-designed and very fun area. It still acts as something of a tutorial, and is a good way to make sure the player doesn't get bored fighting one mini-boss or trying to get past this one point early and quit, because if they're having a hard time with something, they can always take a break and go to the Hirata Estate to progress there. The estate is on fire, and bandits have come to raid it, but it seems too organized for a simple raid, and Sekiro's father, Owl, is there. Some nice foreshadowing for that. Once the wolf gets through this area, we find out how Kuro was taken and how the wolf was given his immortality. Sekiro was betrayed by an old friend, Lady Butterfly, and she took Kuro to give him to Genichiro and beat the wolf. Back to the Ashina outskirts, the wolf needs to pass a dangerous gorge in the land to get to the castle. This seems fine, right? Onward! Well, maybe not. This is a test of stealth, and is a really great moment. The snake searches for you relentlessly, and you must dash through the tall grass while he is not looking. It's an effective bit of horror in a game that's otherwise not very scary, except for some other parts that I'll get to. Then, in a cathartic moment of glory, you get to do this. Regardless, the wolf presses on. He views some memories of Kuro, and I'm not entirely sure how this works, but it's not worth dwelling on. It's alluded to that the wolf alone makes a very substantial dent in the defensive force of Ashina, which sounds really interesting and awesome as a concept, but the fact that the enemies respawn no matter what lessens that power by a considerable amount. He finally makes it to the gates of Ashina Castle, where he faces off against the last and strongest line of defense of Ashina, Gyobu the Demon. I've already spoken about him, though. Now, we enter the castle and the door closes behind us, an ominous sign for the world design, but let's ignore it for now. The castle is nothing like anything in the game seen so far. The 2 areas I've spoken about so far have been linear with tight progression. The castle's design really opens up, which is something I very much enjoy about this area. In fact, it's probably my favorite area in the game because of this. It doesn't feel like there's this prescribed path with the illusion of choice in ways to get somewhere, which is, again, something we'll get into soon. Sorry for doing that so much, I just want to wait until an example comes up that I can use as evidence to support my point. As I said, the castle is a perfect mix of a prescribed path and a non-linear playground of sorts for you to run around in and explore. There are multiple sub-areas to explore, with optional mini-bosses and encounters. They also run a main required path, which starts on the ground and gradually rises up. Most of the encounter design in the castle is stellar, with this example that I mentioned earlier, plus another area where one of the 7 spears resides, and I think it has almost immaculate level design. Besides, the main path is very well designed too. I think it's very interesting and good that you're traversing the rooftops of this place, although it doesn't really feel like an actual living place, because almost none of the buildings are able to be entered. And even though I get the feeling that it's supposed to feel somewhat deserted, the fact that the only people in this city seem to be soldiers makes it feel pretty dead. Regardless, traversing the rooftops is fun, especially with their grapple, and the hag enemies are a really good match. Plus, this happens. There's a mini-boss our hero has to fight before he gets to fight Genichiro for the second time. Kuro is in the possession of Genichiro, and let me tell you a bit about Genichiro. His clan, the Ashina, is in danger on all sides of being quenched, destroyed. He truly believes that the only way to save his people is by gaining immortality through Lord Kuro's blood. The game, I think, needs to emphasize this much more. When I finished the game, and especially right after beating him, I hated his guts. Perhaps that's just the nature of Souls-like fights and their difficulty, but I think maybe a couple of lines from Isshin or Emma about Genichiro afterwards would have gone a long way to make him a more sympathetic villain. Isshin Ashina, as I mentioned before, is Genichiro's grandfather, and basically the singular person who brought Ashina to power. He is an incredible fighter, and as you well know, the final boss of this game. But he is just kind of chill with the wolf, who is sometimes called Sekiro by Isshin and others. The fact that he's not aggressive towards Sekiro while his grandson and most of his soldiers are is somewhat strange to me, but I don't have to understand. There's probably a good reason for it, and it's just lost on me, and that's okay. Back in the top of the tower of Ashina Castle, Kuro wants to end the vicious cycle of death and greed by severing his immortality, basically making it so that his blood doesn't give immortality anymore. The wolf agrees, and he has to go on a series of fetch quests to get to the correct tools to traverse to the divine realm, to obtain the correct tool to sever Kuro's immortality. These fetch quests are terrible for the pacing of the story, because after them, you're just let loose to do them in essentially any order, and there's 3 of them. You can stumble upon the objective by just exploring the different paths that split off from Ashina Castle. You can feel as if you're just progressing upon the intended path and... Well, let me talk about the level design of these 3 paths before I talk more about the story. The wolf must collect a flower from the sunken valley to bring back to Kuro. First, he must confront the soldiers of the gun fort. These enemies are introduced expertly here, as well as the general structure of this entire area. In the entrance to this area, the wolf must use his grapple to reach lower and lower ledges to finally come to this. First, you use your grappling hook to get across this large chasm, and then you're introduced to the fact that you're going to be shot at from multiple different angles. Next comes this big bridge, which I've already said is great, and then this large hill or cliffside. You must battle against ranged enemies up this hill, which makes it all the more treacherous because you have to deal with them the entire time, and then you're assaulted by enemies with shotguns as soon as you get up here, ramping the tension and subverting your expectations that it would get easier as soon as you could get past the long-range enemies. Then you get into the cave and you see your salvation, the sculptor's idol, except this place has just one more enemy in it. The cave, too, has a much different, spookier tone than the previous climb. This is a great gauntlet because it's constantly subverting your expectations, surprising you, and is different from most anything in the game. After exploring a bit, you exit the cave, and it's another bridge. That freaked me out so badly the first time I went through the game. Another surprise, and now a stealth section with the snake, who is again a great addition. This time the stealth is in the water, and continuing the tradition of going from one little ledge, or in this case patch of grass, to another, you must dash in short bursts. Once you get past the snake, the enemy type you'll be engaging with is monkeys, and it's made very clear that this valley is not a place of humanity. It's a toxic, unwelcoming place, filled with hostile animals. In fact, the giant snake makes its home here, in a cave at the end of the valley. The ground here is covered in an acid that will slow and damage Sekiro, and gunshots ring out, echoing through the valley, firing against intruders, guns operated by monkeys, of course. This valley has very striking visual design with more vibrant colors than any other area in the game. With greens and browns everywhere, this valley has been reclaimed by nature. It's very distinct, and this is reflected even in its level design. You must, again, move from small safe area to another small safe area, jumping over the acid. You must now fight monkeys with guns while doing this, and deal with their fire, building upon the concepts introduced throughout this whole section of the game. And there's even a mini-boss with these concepts used later to test your skill with them that you've built up over the entire time in the valley. Bet you didn't even notice that this was happening, did you? This is a really great example of concepts being taught to a player, built upon, combined with each other, and then tested in a final test of skill. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice uses this structure quite a bit, using enemies to teach players how to fight bosses, using subtle gimmicks in level design, and recontextualizing of bosses and sometimes even areas. After you confront the guardian ape and grab the flower, you traverse into the depths of Ashina by doing this. What an entrance, right? That's a super creative and interesting way to send your player down there. But it makes us come to an unfortunate terms with a problem plaguing the game's overall world design that I alluded to earlier. How do you get back up to the top? After that fall, how the hell are you supposed to get back to the rest of the world? An elevator, perhaps? Or maybe stairs? Or maybe a series of grappling hook ledges? In fact, that'd probably be the best way to do it. It incorporates a mechanic we already have experience with. Or, in the best way, perhaps a shortcut to some other part of the world to make it feel alive and interconnected. But the game doesn't do this. Instead, it has a fast travel system, which would be fine. In fact, it is fine. It works well enough for what Sekiro is, a linear game that you wouldn't want to backtrack through. So it has fast travel. However, this comes with so many problems. As I mentioned, Sekiro has a very linear structure. If you don't know what this means, it means the player is railroaded into a developer-intended path and doesn't get much choice in where to go next. Of course, Sekiro is linear in that you go on an intended path from area to area, and only really get to explore that area. Once you're done with that area, you don't really have any reason to come back to it. In the middle of the game, you can go 3 separate areas in any order and complete them, but I still consider that semi-linearity because each path has only one entrance, and approaching them in different orders doesn't change or affect much of anything. Don't get me wrong, I love linearity, and it can work wonders in the right games. In fact, I think it works much better than the open design in a lot of games. But if open design is executed very well, it is much more preferable for me. And by open design, I mean world design as found in games such as Breath of the Wild, Hollow Knight, or Dark Souls. Interconnected worlds with multiple connections between multiple areas, but this is hard to pull off. I have a video essay in the works about this particular subject, so I'll try to be concise and keep my thoughts only on Sekiro. In Sekiro, it seems to me that the game would be much improved with these shortcuts and interconnections between areas, but this game has such an aversion to this that there are places where it's impossible to leave on foot, forcing you to fast travel. This turns the game from an actual world to a series of contained areas that you press a button to travel between. This is an immersion killer. Some of the areas would have to be redesigned to accommodate for new entrances, but I think letting the player organically discover one of the multiple entrances to the same place, and then be delighted when they find a different way out, is worth it. Everything feels so disconnected right now, and like it relies on fast travel far too heavily. There are so many fast travel points, it just feels like a list of completely separate locations. On top of this, sometimes it feels like parts of the game were designed in this interconnected manner, but just weren't taken full advantage of. For example, there's a shortcut in between the two focal points of the game. Building upon this, Ashina Castle already connects to 3 areas of the game. If those other areas just had connections to each other, the game would be much improved. You'd feel like you were actually traveling through a real area in Japan. Without fast travel, it would feel more genuine. And the wolf is so fast and has such good movement that backtracking wouldn't be that tedious. From Software has already shown their expertise in the area of world design in Dark Souls 1. I just wish they would do it again and design a place that feels like, well, a place. But as I said, I have a video coming out that delves into this in more detail, and I don't want to get too much into it here. Suffice it to say that Sekiro could have had much better world design and opted instead not to have it, which is extremely disappointing to me. Regardless, the wolf continues his journey into the depths. This area starts off with a mini-boss I mentioned earlier. It finishes off the progression of jumping from one small safe area to another while having shots fired at you with a mini-boss that also fires at you while you have to fight it with an acid floor. We move to a heavily fogged up area with illusionary soldiers that the wolf must fight through to get to the source of the mist and kill it. This mist area is very interesting because of the low visibility and surprise enemies. We move on to the Mibu village, full of shuffling, zombie-like creatures that attack the wolf at every turn. This area has a very striking aesthetic because of the ruined town around the lake it houses. It makes you wonder what happened here, and once he gets through it, the wolf aptly fights a ghost. I don't really have much more to say about this area. It doesn't have many good encounters, but not many bad ones either. It's just kind of mediocre. The atmosphere and spookiness is very, very nice, and I like that it gives you the ability to swim underwater after you finish it, so you can go back through and explore the lake and river. Anytime after the Ashina Castle, the wolf may go through the Senpou Temple and retrieve the Mortal Blade, which will be able to sever Kuro's immortality. Senpou has decidedly the best atmosphere in the whole game. It's my favorite kind of creeping, horrifying atmosphere. Something is wrong here, I just can't put my finger on what. And it's executed beautifully. Just listen to this battle music. You fight monks who have forsaken Buddha and are in search of a way to gain immortality. There are these inhuman, immortal creatures that make themselves more apparent the further you get into the area. It gets more unsettling as you go, and again, it's an uphill climb, supporting Sekiro's stellar verticality. A European knight guards the bridge desperately, and he makes this whole thing all the more unsettling. But then there's this even more unsettling monkey encounter. After you finish that, you reach the Inner Sanctum, which is one of the most calming and peaceful places in-game, as a very good contrast to the rest of this place. This is probably my favorite area atmospherically in the game. Its lore is also very interesting, but I won't talk about it right now because this isn't a lore video. However, the sheer amount of enemies and the fact that I don't enjoy fighting these enemies very much at all makes me pretty lukewarm about it. After the wolf has gathered the items needed, let's get back to the story. Did you forget this game had a story? Because I did while I was playing. There are some major issues with the pacing of it, making me, at times, almost completely forget it was there. And the story itself, as in the content of it and the writing, isn't even that bad, but there are some egregious errors with the structure and pacing that makes it a failure. The first major mistake the story makes structurally is where the actual story takes place, and where it doesn't. See, every major story beat in the game happens in the Ashina Castle. More specifically, this one little part of it at the top, all of 2 rooms. This means that everything you do in the game feels like a fetch quest, going to grab something and then bringing it back, which isn't good for pacing, especially since you can go to 3 areas without being reminded of why, and it's optional to go check back in with Kuro a lot of the time. It feels very much like an arbitrary list of things to do when you go back and are told to get another MacGuffin, which takes you out of the story. Another issue is that the story beats are spaced very, very far apart. The first one is at the beginning of the game, being the fight with Genichiro. The second big beat of the story comes almost a third into the game at the second Genichiro fight in the little tower. You get Kuro back, and then he tells you to go on these 3 fetch quests. And then the game goes another good long while, more than a third more of the game, before you get to this next large story beat, still at the tower. It's paced very poorly because the player can and will actually forget what they're doing and why they're where they are. How can this be fixed? Well, I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, have story beats happen outside of this one tower and more frequently. Perhaps some recurring characters who are traveling the world, just as you are, and that remind you of your quest. But also, I think large story beats should occur in places that aren't the castle. For example, perhaps after you beat the Guardian Ape, one of Genichiro's goons, like a general in his army, could ride up on a horse and steal the flower that Sekiro needs to obtain, and then maybe a mini-boss fight? That's just an example, though. I think things like that could go a long way to keep you invested in the story and the villain. It would be so much better if the story were to be reworked in such a manner that there were more story beats in different places and that fleshed out the villain and the characters more. The story just felt pretty disconnected, like the world design, and somewhat bare bones. I rarely saw Genichiro, and the final boss, being Isshin, felt very abrupt. After I went and read up on the lore, it made a lot more sense, but I just feel like it could have been better done in the actual story. So, essentially, the story is of high quality within the context of the lore, but the execution is pretty awful. Well, regardless, after 3 fetch quests, we come upon the best part of the story, or at least the best moment in it. After you collect the items for the fetch quests, you naturally rest at a sculptor's idol to go back to the top of the tower and get to Kuro. However, everything is grayed out, and you can't travel anywhere except for one place, so you get nervous, thinking, what happened? Then you travel to the one place, and this happens. Everything's on fire and the castle has been invaded. You have to fight your way through the city, with multiple new paths through it via these makeshift bridges. The entire area has new enemies and is completely recontextualized. The moment of, oh shit, what happened? And then the whole area being different was one of the best story moments in the game. Plus, they're new enemies that you haven't seen before and are actually quite difficult and well designed. Once the wolf gets to the top of the tower, he meets his father, trying to capture Kuro. Old Owl is alive. Wow. I may have missed the clues for this, but this feels a little unearned. I like him and the conflict he creates within the narrative and within the wolf, but there was little foreshadowing for Owl's comeback, or maybe I just missed it. And it turns out that the owl was leading the bandits from earlier in the Harada estate section. Anyway, he leads the invading army and wants Kuro's blood and immortality for himself. The wolf can either beat him and continue forwards, or side with him because a shinobi must follow their father first and foremost. You can end the game here by siding with Owl. The wolf will fight Emma, and then Isshin in his current enfeebled state. Once he kills both of them, the owl will look over the edge of the tower, proclaiming all of Ashina as his own. Then, Sekiro will kill him and take Isshin's sword. He becomes Shura, which means he goes on a path of destruction and carnage. Through the ending monologue, it can be inferred that he still haunts Ashina to this day, killing just for the sake of it. And I think it's compelling that you could just decide to be the villain of the story. Now, back to the good ending. The wolf must now travel to the Divine Realm so he can retrieve something to sever Kuro's immortality. The way he gets there is super great. I've already discussed the level design of this area a bit, but let me delve into it a little more. It starts out as a claustrophobic series of buildings designed for stealth, which is actually pretty great. Then, as I've discussed, the next bit could be better. Its visual design looks really nice though, and I quite like the way it's laid out for exploration. There's a river below, and buildings built high up on stilts, providing a nice contrast. The river leads to a lake that you can also explore, which is also done well, really well. The wolf then ascends a mountain with the enemies placed on it to make sure you know how to deal with lightning before confronting the divine dragon. Then, in a flash of brilliance, the wolf goes back to the field where he fought Genichiro at the beginning of the game, going full circle. He fights Genichiro and then Isshin. See, Genichiro has found a way to imitate Kuro's power with his own version of the Mortal Blade. He brings Isshin back in his prime, and together they will try to defeat you to gain immortality and gain Kuro's power. Once Sekiro kills Isshin, he severs Kuro's immortality in a saddening cutscene in death. And then we see this cutscene. Sekiro becomes the new sculptor. And I don't really understand this little twist, but again, I don't have to. It's a pretty neat ending. Sekiro's combat has the best core loop and mechanics that I've ever experienced. The game is an absolute joy to play and the bosses are near perfect. The difficulty is extreme, and I love that about Sekiro. The mini-boss design has some flaws, namely repeat bosses, uninteresting twists, and some bad fights, but overall is pretty great. The ordinary enemy encounters are also fun and challenging, although stealth and lack of enemy variety brings them down. The world design isn't bad, just extremely disappointing considering what could have been, and the story has some good concepts and moments, but the execution is heavily flawed. The way it conditions you to play like the wolf and be Sekiro is revolutionary and astoundingly innovative, and I can't wait to see where this concept goes in the medium. I think making the player tell the story through the way they decide to play, or the way the game conditions them to play, is something that can and should be explored much further in future games. Overall, Sekiro is one hell of an experience, and its innovation and combat are simply incredible.